In the 1930s, the modern comic book came about. As a result, people complaining about comic books also came about. This is the story of the infamous Comics Code Authority. Welcome back to Amazing Comics, where we explore iconic tales involving our favorite superheroes. In today's video, we'll go beyond the stories of the heroes themselves and tell a real-life tale that affected them all. If you've never heard of the Comics Code Authority, it was an industry-run censorship board that ensured the censorship of mainstream comics for roughly half a century. To understand where the Comics Code came from, you have to understand the history behind modern comics. Comic books as we know them now came around in the 1930s. That brought along people complaining about comics, claiming that comics corrupted the young and turned them into delinquents. Hysteria would result in editorials in newspapers like A National Disgrace by Sterling North, published in the Chicago Daily News in 1940. The article lamented that Action Comics were sex horror serials and sadistic drivel, demanding a return to children only reading old novels from previous centuries. Eventually, this moral panic even led to mass comic book burnings in the late 1940s. Out of fear of pending censorship legislation or regulation, a group of major comic book publishers came together to form the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers in May 1947, publicly announcing the group a year later, in July 1948. Most organizations involved weren't very notable in terms of today's comics. What was notable was EC Comics, not to be confused with DC Comics. EC was a central part of the story of the formation of the Comics Code. EC was formed by Max Gaines as Educational Comics in 1944, after selling off his previous company, All American Publications, which published the original Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, Flash, and others. All American was merged with Detective Comics Inc., which published exactly the comic you think, and then into National Allied Publications, who were most famously the original publishers of Action Comics, where Superman came from. The merged company was National Comics, later National Periodical Publications. As you might have guessed from that description, it was National that would in fact go on to become the famous DC Comics that we know today. After Max Gaines formed EC, he would tragically pass away in 1947, leaving the company to his son Bill, who rebranded EC from Educational Comics to Entertaining Comics, moving away from educational material into more horror, suspense, and sci-fi. As the hysteria over comic books continued, Bill joined the other publishers in forming the Association of Comics Magazine Publishers. The group created a publisher's code in 1948 based on the Hays Code, which was the self-censorship code used by Hollywood's movie industry at the time. The ACMP's code had 6 rules: no lewdness, crime should not be sympathetic, no sadistic torture, no vulgar language and minimal slang, divorce should not be funny or glamorous, and no attacking or ridiculing religious or racial groups. The code proved ineffective, as many publishers didn't bother with the code. Only 2 years in 1950, Bill Gaines pulled EC Comics out of the ACMP after an argument with the group's director. Within a few years, the few remaining publishers were just using the ACMP seal of approval on their comics, without any actual review. This should have been the end of it, but the public's fear of comics continued. In 1954, psychiatrist Frederick Wertham published his infamous book, Seduction of the Innocent. The book asserted that comics encouraged immoral and illegal behavior in children, based on the depictions of such behavior in what Wertham called crime comics. Wertham's definition of crime comics didn't just include stories about crime, but included horror and superhero comics as well, in effect attacking the entire medium. Seduction of the Innocent is perhaps most notorious for claiming that the characters Batman and Robin were gay. It also claimed that Wonder Woman was a lesbian and that Superman was a fascist. None of these claims were true, but the public at large ate them up anyway. The book was incredibly influential, firing up the general public and concerned parents. Seeing a political opportunity, Senator Estes Kefauver, the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency, decided to conduct hearings that same year on the impact of comics on juvenile delinquency. During the hearings, Wortham would be called to testify and gave a long speech repeating the things he'd said in his book, among his other works, asserting that comics were directly causing juvenile delinquency. Later, EC Comics publisher Bill Gaines would testify. Gaines was more hot-headed with the senators who, already biased in favor of Wortham's point of view, were much more hostile toward him. Gaines's anger and lack of experience in such situations allowed the subcommittee to bait him into saying that gruesome images were in good taste. The media, pumping up the mass hysteria, would then run with those comments to stir up more anti-comic fervor in the public. Seeing that public sentiment was only continuing to rise against them after the hearings, Gaines would call a meeting with other major comics publishers later that year in the hope of coming up with something to avoid likely government regulation of the comics industry. Gaines wanted to form an association and hire independent researchers to do a proper study into whether or not comics actually caused the problems they were accused of. Unfortunately for Gaines, the other publishers had no interest in that, instead deciding to take the meeting in a different direction. Another attempt at the ACMP's code to create a censorship apparatus before the government did it for them. By late 1954, the industry had settled on their new direction. They formed the Comics Magazine Association of America with CMAA co-founder, the publisher and co-creator of Archie Comics, John Goldwater, as president of the organization. The CMAA named Judge Charles F. Murphy of New York, a specialist in juvenile delinquency, as its administrator, and created the Comics Code Authority, a set of censorship rules based on the old ACMP code. The Comics Code's rules were even more restrictive than the smaller rule set of the ACMP, with a whopping 41 rules. Everything in the ACMP's code was included and extended, with much more included as well. Anything suggestive or very violent was now entirely banned, as were horror and monsters. Evil and criminals were not allowed to win or be successful in any way, and even disrespecting authority was banned. The code also extended to the advertisements in books as well. Unlike the old ACMP code, which went largely ignored, the Comics Code had teeth, often even stepping beyond the rules explicitly laid out in the code. The Comics Code scheme required submitting comics to the CCA for approval to receive authorization to use the Comics Code seal. While participation in the Comics Code scheme was voluntary, most distributors would refuse to carry comics that didn't have the Comics Code seal of approval. Ironically, this extreme strictness still didn't go far enough for Dr. Wortham, who claimed the code was a half measure and continued attempting to connect comic books to real-life serial killers. Nonetheless, the code would remain in effect for decades. The CCA's restrictions, seemingly deliberately, hit EC Comics titles hard, with most titles being cancelled because the comic distributors refused to carry them due to their horror themes and titles containing words like horror and terror, which were explicitly forbidden by the code. For a short time, Gaines tried a new lineup of comics, mostly focused on more realistic or sci-fi and fantasy themes. After distributors again refused to carry the first wave of those books because they didn't have the Comics Code seal, Gaines would reluctantly submit all his comics to the authority for approval going forward. EC would have one of the first victories over the Comics Code in 1956, with their attempt to reprint the story Judgment Day in Incredible Science Fiction, issue 33. An allegory for racism, the Judgment Day story was originally published in 1953 in Weird Fantasy issue 18, before the establishment of the Comics Code. Written by Al Feldstein and illustrated by Joe Orlando, Judgment Day depicted a human astronaut visiting a planet of robots and determining they were unsuitable for the Galactic Republic due to their discrimination of differently colored, but otherwise identical robots. At the end of the story, the astronaut removes his helmet and is revealed to be a black man, in a clear reference to the real-life racial discrimination of the era. When reviewing the story, Comics Code Administrator Judge Murphy would order EC to change the story, objecting to it because the main character was black. Keep in mind that racism was still common in the 1950s, so Judge Murphy's objections likely weren't too out of the ordinary. However, since changing the astronaut to not be black would clearly break the story's allegory, and since the Comics Code made no explicit mention of race, Murphy had nothing but his position to back up his orders. EC owner Gaines and his editor, the writer of the story, Al Feldstein, had a heated phone exchange with Murphy, with Gaines threatening to go to the press and file a lawsuit. The conversation ended abruptly, with Gaines and Feldstein cursing out Murphy before hanging up, but the story ultimately ran in the intended issue unmodified. Hilariously, a writer's name would cause confusion with the Comics Code's censorship policies. In 1970, writer Marv Wolfman referenced himself, the storyteller, as a wandering Wolfman in a story in the DC Comics book House of Secrets number 83. Due to the code's ban on werewolves, this initially caused the story to be rejected by the CCA, until fellow writer Jerry Conway clarified the reference to the CCA, who allowed it so long as Wolfman was credited in the story. The code would ultimately be updated and softened a few times. For example, various changes were made in 1971, such as a slight softening on the rules on suggestive content, as well as allowing for the depiction of corrupt public officials and the killing of police by criminals. Additionally, certain monsters were allowed to be depicted if the depiction was similar to classic literature. Not included were zombies, which Marvel and DC got around by using the term zoovembies. Famously, one of the biggest hits to the code would come in the same year. In 1971, Stan Lee, the famous Marvel Comics writer and then editor-in-chief, was approached by the US government. The Nixon administration's Department of Health, Education and Welfare, which was the predecessor of today's Department of Health and Human Services, approached Stan, requesting that Marvel create a story about the dangers of drug abuse. Stan would agree, writing a 3-issue story arc in The Amazing Spider-Man issues 96 through 98, in which Peter Parker deals with his friend Harry Osborn's addiction to drugs, while as Spider-Man, he deals with the resurgence of Harry's father Norman's Green Goblin persona. CMAA President John Goldwater, acting as CCA administrator because the actual administrator was sick, rejected the story, despite no official mention of drugs in the Comics Code rules. In spite of this, because the request had come directly from the government, Stan published the comic anyway without CCA approval, with the support of Marvel publisher Martin Goodman. Much to the CMAA and CCA's chagrin, the story arc not only sold very well despite the lack of CCA approval, but was also very well received by the public, dealing a blow to the organization's credibility. Marvel did, however, return to submitting stories for Comics Code approval after the story arc finished. DC Comics publisher Carmine Infantino attacked Marvel for publishing the story in defiance of the code, announcing that DC wouldn't do any drug-related stories without a change to the Comics Code. However, the bad publicity for the CCA generated by the story's release caused a significant revision, allowing the depiction of drugs if shown in a negative light. In a funny turn of events, DC then quickly published a similar story later that same year in Green Lantern Green Arrow number 85, with Green Arrow's sidekick Speedy becoming a heroin addict. This story actually had been written much earlier, but was rejected by DC's own editor Julius Schwartz before it could be submitted to the CCA, as he didn't believe it would be approved, but with the updated code, it was quickly published. Years later, Stan Lee would describe the CCA somewhat sympathetically, comparing them to lawyers, very literal and technical. I'll refrain from making any lawyer jokes. As time went on, many publishers would fold, leaving fewer and fewer members of the CMAA. Meanwhile, a new generation of comic book distributors arose. Unlike the older distributors who sold comics with other magazines to retailers, like newsstands at grocery stores and convenience stores, and refused to carry comics unapproved by the CCA, these new distributors specialized in comic books and didn't bother with CCA approval. In combination with retailers loosening or dropping Comics Code requirements, newer specialty retailers like comic book shops, as well as the rise of direct-to-consumer distribution, where the publishers began directly selling subscriptions to readers via mail, the power of the Comics Code Authority began to wane. At one point in the 80s, only 4 major publishers remained: DC, Marvel, Archie, and a company called Harvey Comics, which published characters like Richie Rich and Casper the Friendly Ghost. Harvey Comics would eventually fold, while other publishers would also come and go later in the Comics Code's lifespan, such as Now Comics, a company mostly known for licensed material that would also go under, and Bongo Comics, created by Simpsons and Futurama creator Matt Groening, which published Simpsons and Futurama comics, as well as some SpongeBob comics. By the mid-80s, the new distribution companies and independent publishers had taken a significant chunk out of the Comics Code Authority's influence, and some of the market share from the code using major publishers. This prompted another review of the Comics Code, with most CMAA member publishers preferring to keep the old code, or something very similar. However, DC revolted, having already begun eschewing Comics Code approval for some of its titles, beginning with 1984's Swamp Thing issue 29. The Comics Code Authority had rejected the Swamp Thing issue, only for DC to decide to stop submitting Swamp Thing to the CCA altogether, publishing without the seal of approval. DC then began publishing other more mature titles without submitting them to the CCA as well. As a result, DC objected to a new version of the Comics Code being as restrictive as the existing version, regarding it as an embarrassment and lamenting its creative restrictions. Thus, a new code was ultimately accepted in 1989, significantly looser than before, but it didn't mean that much, as many publishers were already bypassing the Comics Code, either for certain titles or altogether. A little over a decade later, the biggest blow to the Comics Code would come from another spat with Marvel. In 2001, Marvel submitted the book X-Force issue 116 to the CCA for approval, only to have it rejected, with significant changes demanded. This appeared to annoy Marvel so much that rather than make those changes, Marvel permanently dumped the Comics Code and its seal altogether, publishing X-Force 116 and all future comics with no seal of approval. Marvel would instead opt to create its own rating system, which it continues to use a revised version of today. Roughly another decade would pass before major developments in the Comics Code would roll in again. In 1964, a management firm known as the Kellen Company took over administration of the CMAA, and therefore the CCA. This agreement would come to an end in 2009. At this point, the only publishers still participating in the Comics Code were DC, Archie, and Bongo Comics. Even advertisers had stopped factoring in Comics Code approval in deciding which books to advertise in. Bongo Comics would quietly discontinue participation in 2010, with Bongo ultimately shutting down entirely in 2018. Shortly after, in early 2011, DC, who at this point were only submitting some of their books to the CCA, announced they were abandoning the Comics Code entirely in favor of their own rating system, like Marvel had a decade prior. The next day, Archie Comics, now the only remaining publisher in the Comics Magazine Association of America and using the CCA, announced they too would drop the Comics Code. However, in Archie's case, the company already hadn't been submitting its comics to the CCA for some time, instead just slapping the seal of approval on without review. They were able to get away with this, likely because the CCA had no management since the Kellen Company ceased administration, and the types of comics Archie published were unlikely to be affected by the code anyway. With the exit of Archie Comics from the CMAA, it and the Comics Code Authority were rendered completely defunct, with no one to run it and no member publishers to fund it, finally cementing the downfall of the Comics Code. Today, the CMAA, legally Comics Magazine Association of America, Inc., still legally exists and is considered an active entity by the state of New York, but it has no members or administrators and is therefore completely defunct, with no remaining influence in the industry. Ironically, the Comics Code Seal of Approval is now owned by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, an organization that strongly opposed the Comics Code Authority. The last few years of the CMAA raise a few questions, though. Namely, while Archie had ceased submitting comics to the CCA once the Kellen Company pulled out of managing the organization, who were DC and Bongo sending their comics to for the final years? It turns out, in the final years of the Kellen Company's management of the CMAA, the executive in charge was a woman named Holly Munter Koenig, at the time a senior vice president of the Kellen Company. When the Kellen Company officially pulled out of the CMAA, Koenig took over Comics Code reviews herself. Koenig would review what comics DC and Bongo sent on her own time, with the help of her husband, not only checking for Comics Code adherence, but even continuity errors. In later years, she would remark that the writers had seemed to sometimes attempt to slip things past her by using foreign slang. It's worth noting that while the Comics Code was largely a blight on the comics industry, not every result of the Comics Code's reign was a total negative. While superhero comics had been around since the late 1930s, with the beginning of the Golden Age marked by Superman's debut in 1938, superhero comics had been on the decline by the mid-1950s when the Comics Code was introduced, and other genres were taking over the medium. However, with the introduction of the Comics Code in 1954, and its strict enforcement, publishers were forced to reconsider what comics they were publishing. As a result, publishers that focused more on action-oriented tales would find the superhero genre to be an appropriate choice, thus leading them to retool existing characters and introduce a plethora of new experimental heroes, revitalizing the superhero genre and ushering in the Silver Age. The Silver Age brought in many of the now standard aspects of the retooled heroes, as well as many of the new characters we know and love today. Starting with DC's introduction of the modern Flash, Barry Allen, a character changed from his Golden Age counterpart, Jay Garrick. Similarly, Green Lantern was changed from the Golden Age's Alan Scott to the more modern identity Hal Jordan. Other DC characters like Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were retooled, but their identities remained the same. DC's Justice Society of America was also changed, replaced with the now iconic Justice League of America. The JSA was originally made up of Golden Age characters that are lesser known today, but Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman were eventually added to the team. With the Silver Age, the JSA was replaced with the Justice League we know today, with DC's heavy hitters making up its founders and leadership, though a version of the JSA would eventually be reintroduced. The Silver Age also gave us most of Marvel's biggest characters. While Marvel would similarly retool a few of its original characters, for example, replacing the Golden Age's android Human Torch, Jim Hammond, with the Fantastic Four's Johnny Storm, and reintroducing the Golden Age hero Captain America without an identity change, it didn't have the same existing roster that DC did. With DC's success in revitalizing the superhero genre, the freshly renamed Marvel Comics would introduce the Fantastic Four to capitalize on the trend to great success, followed by other hits we know today like Spider-Man, Iron Man, the Hulk, the X-Men, and many more. Marvel also brought in their own answer to the Justice League a few years later, with the now famous Avengers, which reintroduced Captain America, who joined a number of Marvel's major characters. The Comics Code unintentionally kicked off the Silver Age of superhero comics, which was such a massive success, it made the superhero genre nearly synonymous with the American comic book, even to this day. Much like how Superman is the stereotypical superhero, the superhero comic is the stereotypical comic book. They're so tightly associated, I even named my channel Amazing Comics, even though most of what I talk about is superheroes, and you probably didn't even question it. The Silver Age boom was something of a silver lining that came out of the Comics Code. One common mistake often made is the misattribution of the reluctance of superheroes, most notably Batman, to kill their villains. Commonly, you'll see this reluctance attributed to the Comics Code, but this actually predates the CCA. In the early days, superheroes were heavily influenced by pulp fiction heroes, the old-school hard-boiled detective or adventurer types, with no qualms about brutally killing their enemies. Pulp heroes like Doc Savage, the Shadow, and the Spider were the forerunners of the modern superhero. Like the pulp heroes they came from, the earliest heroes did kill. Batman, in his earliest appearances, carried a gun, while Superman would often kill his enemies in silly ways. Since the heroes didn't have many recurring popular villains yet, it made little difference to the continuing stories. Very early on in the Golden Age, however, the superheroes began gaining popularity with a different audience than the more adult-oriented pulp heroes. Superhero comics were gaining significant popularity among children, to a point where DC, or more specifically, its editorial director Whitney Ellsworth, foresaw some of the issues that would plague the comics industry down the line. Realizing that parents would be very upset if the heroes their children were reading about were mass murderers, Ellsworth instituted an editorial directive: DC's superheroes could no longer kill. This started with Ellsworth saving one of the most iconic villains in all of comics, the Joker. In his very first appearance, 1940's Batman #1, the very first issue of Batman's first dedicated book, the Joker was introduced. Batman #1 was a compilation of a few different stories, including 2 dedicated to the Joker. The first Joker story introduces the Joker and ends with Batman saving him from falling to his death. But the second Joker story, taking place after the first, ends with Joker accidentally stabbing himself while trying to stab Batman. Though the final panels show the paramedics realizing Joker is still alive. Initially, writer Bill Finger had intended to kill off the Joker here, as recurring villains weren't really a thing at the time. But it was Ellsworth who insisted on changing the ending of the story, resulting in the hastily modified ending revealing that Joker is alive. It was this, combined with Batman's brutal murders of enemies in another story in the book, that spurred Ellsworth to implement the no-killing rule at DC, well over a decade before the Comics Code came into place, greatly influencing the modern superhero, with a general principle followed to this very day by both DC and Marvel's best characters. This not only allowed for interesting villains to recur, but nudged writers to come up with more creative stories and endings, rather than just killing the enemy on sight. Thanks to these changes, superheroes aren't just about adventure, but tales of incredible people striving to do the right thing, even against seemingly impossible odds. Batman's pro-life philosophy has evolved to such a strong position that not only will he refuse to kill, but is outright compelled to save anyone from a preventable death, no matter how evil they may be, providing for many different and interesting stories and scenarios. Speaking of Batman, one of the significant influences Frederick Wertham and the Comics Code did have was heavily taking much of the seriousness out of comics, notably with many silly storylines in Batman and Superman throughout the 1960s. Most notably, Batman was significantly lightened, in a vein similar to the Adam West TV show, and attempts were made to avoid Wertham's accusations claiming that Batman and Robin were gay, which they weren't. Wertham had claimed having 3 single men, those being Batman, or Bruce Wayne, Robin, or Dick Grayson, and their butler, Alfred Pennyworth, was suspicious, implying that it signified homosexuality. To appease Wertham and his supporters, DC killed off Alfred in 1964's Detective Comics issue 328, replacing him with Dick's paternal aunt, Aunt Harriet, who took over Alfred's role as the writers wanted Bruce and Dick to remain single. Fortunately, Alfred would be brought back a few years later in 1966 in Detective Comics 356, with Aunt Harriet being written out of the series after Detective Comics number 380 in 1968. The silliness of Batman stories in general would be toned down in the next few years as writers Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams took over Batman, gradually darkening the character more throughout the 1970s, while the influence of the Comics Code began to wane, bringing Batman back to the more grim and serious detective character we know and love today. That said, perhaps the most important beneficial thing the Comics Code Authority did for the comics industry was prevent the government from creating a legally enforced censorship board instead. It may have been a necessary evil to prevent government regulation by creating a more malleable, industry-run system instead. Parallels of this can be seen throughout the years, such as Hollywood and its censorship history with the Hays Code and the MPAA, or the attempts at censorship in the music industry. But perhaps the most similar was the video game industry's battle with censorship and the formation of the ESRB. In 1993, Senators Joseph Lieberman and Herbert Kohl, like Estes Kefauver before them, held hearings on violence and other obscene content in the video game industry, notably with representatives from Nintendo and Sega present, focusing on games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, though neither game was actually aimed at children. Afterward, in 1994, Lieberman would draft a bill to create a government-enforced rating system, but would drop this bill once a second hearing was held with the new industry-run ratings group, now known as the Entertainment Software Association. The ESA had established a ratings board and system known as the Entertainment Software Rating Board, similar to the CCMA and Comics Code. However, unlike the Comics Code, the ESRB would review and classify games under a rating system rather than ban them outright, which was much better for censorship, as the content could still be sold for the most part. With ESRB ratings, the only major restrictions were with the two highest ratings, mature and adults only, and these were voluntary restrictions on the retailers and console manufacturers' ends, and for the most part, are still in place today. Retailers generally won't sell M-rated games without photo ID, while neither retailers nor console manufacturers will sell AO-rated games at all. Despite this system, attempts would continue to ban or restrict violent and obscene content by law, which would culminate in a Supreme Court lawsuit determining the fate of video game censorship in America. In 2005, the governor of California,
Arnold Schwarzenegger,
would sign into law a bill banning the sale of violent video games to minors in California. In response, the ESA and a related group, the Entertainment Merchants Association, would sue the state, with the case
Schwarzenegger
versus Entertainment Merchants Association reaching the Supreme Court. Most relevantly to our topic today, in 2010, before the court heard arguments, Marvel legend Stan Lee would pen a letter to the Video Game Voters Network, an advocacy group sponsored by the ESA, opining against the censorship of video games and urging readers to support the VGVN. The letter directly references some of the comic censorship events we discussed earlier.
Dear Video Game Voters Network, I'm writing to urge gamers everywhere to take a stand and defend both the First Amendment and the rights of computer and video game artists by joining the Video Game Voters Network. My memory has always been lousy, and it's not improving with age, but it's good enough to remember a time when the government was trying to do to comic books what some politicians now want to do with video games: censor them and prohibit the sales. It was a bad idea half a century ago, and it's just as bad an idea now. And you can do something about it. I created Spider-Man, Iron Man, and the Hulk, the virtual ancestors of the characters in today's games. In the 1950s, there was a national hysteria about the so-called dangerous effect comic books were having on our nation's youth. Comic books, it was said, contributed to juvenile delinquency. A Senate subcommittee investigated and decided the U.S. could not afford the calculated risk involved in feeding its children through comic books a concentrated diet of crime, horror, and violence. Comic books were burned. The state of Washington made it a crime to sell comic books without a license. And Los Angeles passed a law that said it was a crime to sell crime comic books. Looking back, the outcry was, forgive the expression, comical. The more things change, as they say, the more they stay the same. Substitute video games for comic books and you've got a 21st century replay of the craziness of the 1950s. States have passed laws restricting the sale of video games, and later this year, the Supreme Court will hear a case about one of those laws. This one passed in California. Why does this matter? Because if you restrict sales of video games, you're chipping away at our First Amendment rights to free speech and opening the door to restrictions on books and movies. The Supreme Court should find the law unconstitutional, as lower courts have, but politicians will keep looking for ways to restrict the rights of gamers and computer and video game artists because it makes for good headlines to say they're protecting the children, even if they're doing no such thing. They do so despite the fact that the industry has a remarkable rating system in place already, and all new consoles have parental controls, both of which help parents ensure parents are in control of what their children play. But you can help fight the battle against politicians. The VGVN was created so gamers can express their views and tell our political readers that it's as ridiculous to worry about video games today as it was to worry about comic books then. Far from being dangerous, video games are increasingly powerful contributors to our nation's entertainment, economy, education, and society. By joining the VGVN, you'll be telling our political leaders that you care enough about the games you play to use your voice and your vote to help those who recognize the realities and benefits of gaming, and punish those who try to restrict both your access to games and your rights. Please join and participate. It'll be good for your Constitution. Thanks. Signed, Stan Lee.
Ultimately, after Governor
Schwarzenegger.
was succeeded by Governor Jerry Brown, and the case was subsequently renamed to Brown versus Entertainment Merchants Association, the Supreme Court would vote 7-2 against the California law in June 2011, with the majority opinion written by Justice Antonin Scalia, who wrote, "Like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas, and even social messages, through many familiar literary devices, such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world. That suffices to confer First Amendment protection." With this ruling and opinion, video games were confirmed to have the same speech protections as comics, TV, movies, and other forms of media. In the years since, the ESRB, unlike the Comics Code, has remained in place, with retailers and console manufacturers continuing to enforce censorship of mature content, with console manufacturers sometimes going out of their way to censor content even further. However, with the rise of both PC gaming and independent games in recent years, many games are now bypassing the ESRB entirely, with certain PC storefronts like Steam and GOG not requiring ESRB ratings and allowing the sale of very mature and even outright adult content on the PC platform, in contrast to consoles. In some ways, this shift mirrors the 1970s and 80s trend away from the Comics Code, as new distributors, retailers, and publishers similarly bypassed the code. You might be wondering, whatever happened to our story's initial protagonist, Bill Gaines, and his company, EC Comics? You've probably noticed we haven't mentioned EC or Bill Gaines since the conflict over the Judgment Day story. Unfortunately, there's a reason for that. Gaines attempted to introduce a new line of comics, as his existing comics were too objectionable for distributors to carry. Since distributors refused to carry his new line of comics without the CCA seal of approval, he reluctantly started sending his comics for CCA approval, though these comics would also ultimately fail within a few years. In 1956, Gaines would ultimately give up on comics altogether, with EC instead focused on publishing its successful Mad magazine, which had debuted a few years earlier. Mad was not only very successful, but unlike his comics, since Mad was a normal magazine, it was exempt from the Comics Code entirely, which made it much easier to publish. In 1961, Gaines sold EC Comics, now EC Publications, to a company called Premier Industries, which would in 1964 turn around and sell EC to National Periodical Publications, which, if you remember earlier, was the company created after Gaines's father Max had sold his All-American Publications company to Detective Comics Inc. Effectively, EC Comics was now owned by DC Comics, though it does seem that Gaines retained the rights to the EC Comics brand and the comics published before the sale. For his part, Gaines had made sure contractually that he could stay on as publisher of Mad magazine, which he did until his passing in 1992. In the years since EC abandoned comics, a few movie and TV adaptations of their comics were made, and their comics continued to be reprinted. And in February 2024, Oni Press announced they would be bringing back the EC Comics brand, licensing the titles from Bill Gaines' family. So that's the story of the rise and fall of the Comics Code and everything that surrounded it. I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, please leave a like and subscribe to this channel. If you didn't, well, thanks for taking the time to listen. And either way, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you got a great comic or topic you think I should cover, drop that suggestion down there too. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time, right here on Amazing Comics.